Good evening. My name's Helen Castle and I'm the editor of architectural design, and I'm just here for 5 minutes this evening before we can get on to the real presentations, really just to introduce the issue and to thank Chris and Sam for the fantastic work they've done on this issue of AD on typological urbanism. Chris and Sam's issue of AD has provided a very important opportunity to look at the relationship between architecture and the city. Whereas architects since Rem Koolhaas have promoted the city as an object of research, as found research, whether it's New York or southern China, Chris and Sam are putting architects back in the driving seat with this issue by looking at specifically at typology. They're asserting a new means of ordering and rationalising the city. They're coming with a compelling alternative to modernist planning, a much more flexible alternative, but still it has that sense of order. On AD, we've now started to commission a counterpoint article for the back of every issue. The idea is that we have the main theme of an issue, which promotes a particular argument, and then at the back we produce a counter argument, so weighing up both sides. And for this issue of AD, Grahame Shane very kindly obliged. Grahame teaches at urban design at Columbia and also Cooper Union in New York, and he's very obligingly come over this week to participate in the event. And he's providing, if you like, the counter argument to the issue. He's arguing for the city in all its diversity and hybridity, unbridled by type. So we'll just see what he's going to tell us. I have the feeling he might be too polite to be too polemical, actually, but we'll just see. We very much like all of you here tonight to enter into the debate with us on AD, and we've left you pens you found on your seat, and they've got the website URL. We just launched a new AD website, and the idea is that you too can join in the debate surrounding the issue, whether you're for or against, whether you're sitting on Sam and Chris's side or Graham's side. So it would be really interesting if anyone has any feedback, if they could just go online and put in their thoughts. So I'd particularly like to thank Chris and Sam tonight for having produced such a well-conceived and researched issue. It's an enormous amount of work, an issue of AD, both thinking through an argument, then commissioning various contributors, and they did it with an exactitude and a very, very quiet efficiency and just got on with it. I'd also like to thank the speakers tonight who've all given up their time as well. And thank you also for Brett, who is continuing to extend his hospitality to AD with various events that we've done here. So thank you very much.
Well, I think just very quickly at the beginning, we wanted to introduce our reasoning for having this ID issue. And of course, first of all, thanks to Wiley and especially Helen Castle for inviting us to do this. The AD issue on typological urbanism developed more than 2 years ago as a complementary investigation to the research carried out with our students in diploma school. Probably should go this way. In typological formations, renewable building types in the city, we reflected on 3 years of teaching during which we attempted to restate the role of the architect within the relentless process of urbanization. The question we asked were, how can we as architects rethink the engagement with the city and reclaim the function of architecture? What are the tools of the discipline to meaningfully develop and implement ideas and designs of cities? And how can we challenge traditional planning parameters and project alternative visions? Our presumption forming the basis of the investigations was that the relationship between architecture and the city provides the primary basis of knowledge. Therefore, we consider the intrinsic relationship between a city and specific building types. This connection is embodied in what we term dominant types, building types with a critical impact on the formation of a city, such as landmarks, infrastructure, socio-political and cultural institutions, housing, and so on. Dominant types, however, only partially intersect with the traditional domain of planning. There are no models or prototypes that are simply repeatable or procedurally adaptable to a context, yet emerge from a conversation between type and model. Dominant types are the specific formations derived from underlying universal motives and are simultaneously a material and social-cultural product. Thus, Rossi referred to type as the analytical moment of architecture, as it provides the possibility of new spatial and collective realities. Typology, consequently, is not just a study of fixed types or taxonomical device, but suggests synergies of multiple layers and scales that dynamically regulate architecture. By abstracting the deep structure of type, its organizational and structural diagrams, type can be analyzed, permitting an operative definition of the parameters that affect architectural form and its relationship to the city. This process of defining the synthesis of architecture in a relevant urban context through the reading of dominant types was the ambition of the work summarized in typological formations. Having studied the functions of form within typological reasoning, we made several observations. Type is fundamentally autonomous of function, and its organizational or structural effect precedes any of its formal realizations. In this sense, form is not a direct product of type, but rather its diagrammatic possibility. While type is always implied in design, typology remains irreducible to a design method or a singular solution. Its significance is rather the analytical potential and the possibility it provides for architecture to reflect on its principles of formation. It hereby exploits a momentary autonomy that permits renewal and invention through typological reasoning and immanent consistency.
So drawing upon this, we wanted to also bring not only projects from the research and the work here done in the AA, but also projects that we think would support this rethinking of type and typology, and therefore to also provide a second reading of how a recourse to typology is necessary when dealing with the urban context and the city. So for instance, in OMA's Penang Tropical City, distinct building types are grouped together to form islands of exacerbated difference. And we could see that as yet another enactment of Colas's idea of the cities within cities, developed with Ungas back in 1977. The proposal here relies on the idea of type as a generator of possibilities and a regulator of real difference. For the project of Toyo Ito's Singapore Buona Vista Master Plan, develops the use of prototypical elements that bears traces to his preoccupations with the problems of collective form that typified the metabolist movement of the 1960s in Japan. In Ito's proposal, the city is envisioned as one that aggregates into a continuous whole, fusing infrastructure, building, open spaces, and services into an integrated piece of architecture. So perhaps the most unusual inclusion, it may seem, is this project. It's the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art, Kanazawa by Sana. But we argue that this project should be understood in conjunction with two other projects by Sejima and Nishizawa. The Moriyama House in Tokyo as a precedent to this museum project, and the recently completed Rolex Learning Center in Lausanne as a successor. The question, and indeed possibility, that these three projects open up is the utilization of the Met building, alternating its solid void relationships from one project to another that embeds the architectural artifact deep into the city fabric of the city, or is set off to create an urbanity of its own. Two projects by Dogma and My Practice series offers a possible demonstration of the manifestation of the idea of the city as an architectural project. Dogma, in their simple heart, architecture on the ruins of the post-Fordist city, investigates this possibility by focusing on the relationship between architectural form, large-scale design, and political economy. This is rendered less as a working proposition, but as an idea of the city brought to its extreme logical conclusion. In the project of recentering, Xi'an Horticulture Master Plan by My Practice theory, the transformation of an artifact of the city is used to confront the problem of centrality and the possible recuperation of the tradition of city making in Xi'an, where the city wall as a dominant type is utilized as the deep structure that sets out the typological grammar for the city, projecting a future for the city by drawing upon its history. So, typological urbanism, in conclusion, brings together arguments and projects that demonstrate a commitment to the empowerment of the architect to once again utilize his or her disciplinary knowledge. It is a re-engagement with architecture's exteriority and architectural experimentation, governed by reason and reinvention, underpinned by typological reasoning. It is an insistence on architecture that not only answers the didactic question of how to, but the metacritical question of why do. Thanks. And I'd like to invite PV to make a presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks first of all, Chris and Sam, for inviting us to contribute to your AD issue, and for us it was very easy to make this contribution because I know actually Chris and Sam worked from several years, and it's very rare today in kind of massive in the condition of mass collaboration to find peers or architects who, with whom to share kind of long-term discussion. And I have to say, Chris has been one of the few with whom actually through my teaching at the AA and also through our other commitments, I had this conversation. So it was this AD opportunity was a rare moment of really sincere collaboration to a project, which deals essentially with two things that both me and Chris and Sam somehow share, which is a deep interest in the city, and perhaps a more controversial interest in the idea of form, which since 20 years has become the dirty word in architecture. When it comes to discussion on form, there is almost kind of a sort of loss of interest in talking about architecture. And of course, there is a lot of gratuitous formalism in today's architectural production. But I do believe, and I think it's something I share very much with Chris and Sam, that a discussion on form and its relationship with the politics and the social context of architecture is of fundamental importance. And I have to say that my work really tried to address this issue. So I'm here to be blamed as formalist. The project I'm going to show you tonight is the project that is being published in AD. It's in fact a project that I've been developing in the last 8 years with Dogma, the practice to which, in which I work together with Martino Tattara. The project is a research which we've been carrying on for a lot of time, and so what I'm going to show you tonight is just a fragment of it, more, let's say, the design proposition. And it deals actually with the context that we are very familiar with, the northwestern metropolitan area of Europe, an area that more and more is becoming really a metropolitan formation where increasingly a large population that lives in this area actually live and work across this, let's say, area that stretched from London to Frankfurt to Amsterdam to Brussels. And in fact, the project which started in 2002 was already imagining this, area as one city, as one new emerging metropolis. And actually, this project came from our direct, let's say, living and working experience, because for a long time, both me and Martino were living in Amsterdam and then in Rotterdam and working in Brussels. So we realized that this sort of transnational commuting was a daily practice of a large number of people working in this area. And we realized that, in fact, it was really a sort of, one could address really a metropolitan, an urban condition that was in its making. There were several events that made us convinced that this was a project that was important to address. The first one, of course, is the rise of the economic model that has dominated society for the last 30 years, which we can roughly address as post-Fordism, which consists in a kind of massive extension of wage labor as a sort of reproduction of social conditions. So, you know, and the paradox of this massive extension of wage labor is that wage labor in post-Fordism has lost its traditional attributes of blue-collar work, what we once we were identifying as the working class, and has taken the kaleidoscopic forms of basically the entire society. And in fact, wage labor today is flexible, is always all the time changing, and assume basically the very basic connotations of the contemporary subject. So this is actually a series of photographs made by Jeff Wall in the late 70s called Young Workers, which was a very important starting point for this project, where Jeff Wall mixed the, let's say, recording of this reality, where work reproduced not only in its traditional context of the factory, but in the university, in the all, let's say, aspects of the urban condition. But Wall actually still represents this expanded condition of wage labor using the iconography of social realism. And precisely this sort of tension between let's say, acknowledgement of this expanded factory that is the post-Fordist city, and the attempt to give this condition a certain almost monumental explicitness is also the very goal of our understanding of this condition and also of our proposal. Another very important event were the 1995 strikes in Paris, where people were in fact protesting against the rise of public transport fees. So it was a strike that was no longer performed in the workplace, but in a public transport network. And this was the first very important strike that was making explicit that the factory was no longer a place, an actual building, but it was the entire city. And of course, social welfare, like public transport, was an important asset of the new expanded assembly line. But even more important precedent was the acknowledgement that one of the leading industry in the northwestern metropolitan area, which actually will survive this part of the continent for the future, is the rising importance of the university and education as the new economic engine of production that will make this area competitive to the rest of the world. And of course, this means a massive, let's say, privatization of education, and at the same time a massive political answer to that kind of phenomena. And in fact, the rise of the idea of the global autonomous university, which recognize cognitive labor as one of the fundamental forms of production in a post-Fordist capitalist city, and in fact address the university no longer as just a place, the ivory tower of knowledge, but as the edufactory, as the factory of immaterial knowledge. And in fact, there are precedents for this kind of idea of the university. I think the most prophetic one is Cedric Price's Pottery Think Belt. For me, a project that is on the verge of being innocent and almost cynic in anticipating this way in which the city itself becomes, the territory becomes the forms of the university. The university becomes literally a factory, and in fact, Price was exploiting the existing industrial railway network of a decaying industrial area in England. And in fact, what is interesting about this project that transformed the idea of the campus into a real territory, actually working, installing this new idea of the expanded the university on the ruins of the Fordist city. So our project, in a way, is an aftermath of that idea, working no longer on the ruins of the Fordist city, but on the ruins of the post-Fordist city. So here actually is an example of the ruin of the post-Fordist city, the emerging typology of the learning center, which is actually, this is actually a project by Kazuo Sejima that Chris was mentioning before, a project that makes evident this sort of massive concentration of knowledge that has no boundaries anymore, that has no partitions, that have no departments. So knowledge in its most basic and generic condition, which of course is called learning center, which echoes a certain kind of productive mission, which is to make multidisciplinarity, knowledge, exchange, cooperation, encounter, not just the default aspect of the traditional campus, but really the productive engine of the university. And this is exactly the type, the dominant type, to use a category put forward by Chris and Sam, that we address with our project, but imagine this condition not as a building, but really as a part of a city. As I said, the context is the northwestern metropolitan area. These were the very initial drawings we were making, trying to imagine this urban constellation made of the three main emerging, rising regions of the Randstad, the Ruhrgebiet, and the Flemish Diamonds, with London, Paris, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam as a sort of appendix, this new metropolitan area, which of course we first try to understand as a territory with, let's say, different concentrations of university and campuses. We soon realized that in a way they all concentrated in these very strong economic zones, and in a way this shows very much the link between knowledge produced by university and its immediate application into the realm of production in general. So at this point, actually, we were thinking how to intervene in this area with a proposal that would not solve this tendency, because I think this is the way actually right now economy is actually reifying knowledge and education, but how that condition would become explicit so that those subjects who are involved in this process, basically us, teachers and students, would be actually quite aware of this process of transformation, and therefore would act critically towards this process. So I don't think that architecture solves problems. Sometimes architecture works better in creating problems that then real subjects and struggles eventually can solve. So the idea was to intervene within this territory by precisely following a tactic that very much I share with Chris and Sam, which is instead of actually going through the act of trying to master plan this territory, to intervene by the definition of a very single, let's say, definition of what Chris and Sam would call a dominant type. Something that has a certain precision in defining a structural and let's say, conceptual and physical model, but by actually relying also on existing conditions, making in fact evident the generic ethos that characterized the post-Fordist expanded factory. So the first very idea that you can barely see in this slide was to superimpose to existing vacant office space of cities along the railway ring that connect Amsterdam, Brussels, and Cologne, a 800 by 800 frame, which actually hosts simple living spaces for those who live and work in these areas, meaning in the whole northwestern metropolitan area. Basically single person rooms, which in fact manifest the fundamental welfare project, which is no longer the right to study, like it used to be in the past, but the right to live, which is, and life today is the very anthropological portrait of our, let's say, productive possibilities, and this is exactly what the new post-Fordist factory is actually putting at work. This actually frame made of single, let's say, student rooms, which in fact will dramatically inflate the square meters existing in the city, so contributing to drop dramatically the rent of these areas, would then link existing increasingly vacant office space that exists in this very close to the cores of these cities. And this is actually one of the paradoxes of the post-Fordist factory. The more work, the ethos of work increase and involve the whole city, the more the typology of office space, which was the traditional, basically, factory of the post-Fordist production, is becoming redundant and vacant, not because work is disappearing, but because work now invests any remote square centimeter of the entire spectrum of the city spaces. So the idea is to simply frame this condition and to make that sort of pervasive condition evident, and to distribute evenly those new urban dominant type along the cities that are touched by this network of public transport. So in a way, it's a kind of expanded, almost geographical university campus. So each city that is along this network would have one identical formation. So the whole kind of system would be legible as such. And it would, in a way, construct this metropolitan formation as one project without actually proposing an overall plan for the city. So this is just, I'm going to show you very fast the images of the project. Dordrecht, Utrecht, Rotterdam, Den Haag, Antwerp, Brussels, Liège, Leuven, Eindhoven, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Mechelen, Aachen, Roosendaal, Duisburg, Delft, Ghent, Amsterdam. So the idea is to first build the frame around the existing area. This is actually south axis, an area that is just south to Amsterdam. So those existing ruins of the post-Fordist city would become no longer just a composition of parts, but a unique amalgam of existing projects, of which, and this sort of condition would make clear that the boundary between inside and outside of these buildings, in a way, completely collapse. The idea is to completely cover with an isotropic canopy all those interstitial spaces, transforming them from, let's say, the existing public space opposed to the private space of buildings as a kind of continuous common space, where in fact today production, which is no longer just sitting and producing something, but this encounter, exchange, affection, is really taking place. And in fact, the idea is to make that sort of continuous expanded factory built on the ruins of the post-40 city explicit as the new core of the metropolitan, the northwestern metropolitan area. It's basically engine, it's basically next stage of development where the, let's say, contrast, the struggle between exploitation, which is the way knowledge today is constantly put at work, and resistance towards this phenomena would have a clear arena of confrontation. Thank you.
Just to quickly say what we're going to do is I think that we're having a second presentation by Marina. I think everyone knows Marina here. She's of course a colleague of ours, and she's the head of the history and critical thinking. And that will be followed by a final presentation by Grahame Shane and a counterpoint, as Helen has already mentioned. I'm actually not really the right person to use this.
I don't need it right.
Really? Okay, I think if you wanted, you just
do that.
Or should we just put it on anyways?
Yes, thank you. Okay. I would also like to thank Sam and Chris for inviting me to contribute to the AD issue and to the discussion today, because that is that okay? Yeah, because that gave us the opportunity to continue our dialogue and collaboration on different issues on type, but also on the different issues on architecture and the city. Of course, I'm not here to today to either embrace or criticize or argue against the notions of type and typology. And I'm not going to put forward perhaps yet another reading of type or another use of type, but I would like to share with you some questions which I try to pose actually through a reflection on the very term type. I mean, being a part of the history and critical thinking, I guess what I problematize is not so much the architectural work. I mean, because, right, let me explain. Raffaello Moneo, in his famous essay in 1978 on typology, he started by saying that to raise the question of type is to raise the question of the architectural work itself. And following on that, but going a step beyond, I would say actually to raise the question of type today is to raise perhaps the question of the way we talk and relate and produce the work of architecture. And in these terms, I would like more, as I said, to interrogate and think through the different uses of the concept of type, the different uses of the notion of type in architecture since its first appearance in architectural thought in the 18th century. I'm not going to give a survey of these functions and meanings of the term type, but just I want to point out that type has been, whether we, as I said, we are critical against the use of type or the kind of recovery of type and typology or not. I would like to say that it has been, as a term, as a notion, as a concept, very instrumental and very decisive in architectural thought and practice since the 18th century. And it has been used either to signify a model, to signify a principle, which can generate or explain the generation and production of architectural forms. It has been used as an instrument of analysis, either of the discipline or of the city. For instance, in the 1950s, it has been used as element of design, as something which has informed methods of design. But in all of these cases, somehow type seems to have been very decisive in the way it has transformed theoretical speculations into architectural and design strategies. And I think that's why it is still relevant to raise the question of type today, and especially the question of type as a way to think on and reflect on the relationship between the architectural work and the city. So for me, the problem is first linguistic. So, because the notion of type in general, what does, it does enable us to develop a manner to describe, to characterize, to name an architectural work or an architectural project, and primarily as a group, as part of a group of objects, or as part of a group of strategies or a group of processes. This has, at least in my view, two implications. If type has been used to name, to organize, to classify architectural works, so in one way it contributes to the production of a disciplinary knowledge, to the production of a discourse on architecture. And of course, as such, it also determines to an extent the production of architecture. And the second is that the type in one way inscribes the particular, the singular, the work as a singular entity within the general. In one way, in a paradoxical way, it indicates at once the particular, the individual, and the collective. The particular as an individual entity, as a singular entity, and as part of a collective. Because also type, we should not forget that it both signifies a quality, which is to distinguish a group of objects, but also it can designate, it can exemplify, it can indicate an object which displays the characteristics of that group. So in one way, both indicates a general quality or general principle, but also it can signify an object which can be seen as characteristic of that principle of that group. Following on this, I would like just to make 2 points more to open up the discussion for today. That one of the major functions of the notion of the idea of type has been to establish connections between the architectural work and a broader set of milieu or of conditions. So in one way, I said, to locate the architectural work with a broader context, either historical or disciplinary or material context, or urban, social or political context. So in one way, it locates the architectural work in relation to a set of external forces, but also to mechanisms which are inherent to its production. So for me, it lies exactly at that intersection, and that's why it's still, as a question, very relevant, both in architectural thought and design, because it lies exactly at the intersection of methods of design, processes of production, and forms of knowledge, and forms of thinking and relating to the production. And I think as such it has played, and that's why it has also played a very strategic role in the confrontations between architecture and the city. And just an instance, an episode of that role, of that function of type, is exactly the use of type in modernism, the typical unit or the typical building. Let me just... Here we have a quote from Gropius' text, The New Architecture in the Bauhaus from 1937, which I think captures all these issues together. So here Gropius talks about the reiteration of typical, that means typified, that means standardized buildings, increasingly approximating to the successive stages of manufacturing process, and that notably enhances civic dignity and coherence. So here already the typical, as the typified, as the mass-produced object or the standard or standardized product provides a framework for conceptualizing architecture as part of a social and ideological agenda, and to formalize the connection between the ideal of architectural perfection, the perfected, here the standardized, also the perfected object, and the laws of economy, putting together an ideal with economy, process of economy, in order to negotiate the singular as part of the production of the collective. So in one way here, the typical, the element or the individual is rendered typical, typified, in order to contribute to operations which are to generate and regulate the city. So in one way, the typical is to contribute to a specific type of development. So having just taken that particular example from the 1930s, I would like now to reinstate or reframe this hypothesis in contemporary terms. Because of course there are certain criteria that provide an overall different framework for thinking about the project, the work, the product, and its possible engagement with the city or the urban. And of course the first of these criteria, in my view, is, and of course broadly speaking, is historical. I briefly explain how the term type has different functions and in different historical situations. It's the same with the term city. We can hardly use the term city in order to encompass or kind of describe or characterize all the different multiple environments which emerge and develop all around the world. So if we talk about architecture in the city, we first have to rethink both terms, actually, what we mean by the architecture and what we mean by the urban. Also considering, as Rem Koolhaas has stated already 20 years ago, that the extreme and radical urbanization has already altered what we used to term urban condition. So in order to be instrumental or to instrumentalize again within design and within actually architectural theory, concepts like type and typology, we have to rethink or operate within a general logic of signification. And I think it's there where, for me, the criterion becomes social, not only historical. Because if, in order to be able to use certain terms to share, these need to operate within a system. As I said, the city is no longer what we used to experience or understand by the term city. Of course, is that the different environments, the urban now encompasses a diversity of communities, territories, identities. And the issue is that each of these economies, each of these communities of the urban establish their own logic of signification. And that, of course, presupposes a specific understanding what meaning is, what is the possible function or social function of meaning, and so on. So it's not easy to formulate and impose a singular method or even a singular way of talking and explaining. For instance, if for Aldo Rossi in the 1960s, type was to establish a relationship between collective memory and city, and in one way thereby inform the image of the city, if type for him was a kind of apparatus, I mean his own term, a kind of apparatus which could mediate between the singular, the individual object, and the collective subject. The problem is now, what is this, what I'm saying it, what is this collective subject? Now that we have new forms, not only of new urban forms, but new forms of urbanity, and I think that's the point I would like to introduce in the discussion, because we keep on talking about the architectural form, but it's also because type, it has been used to describe and communicate and talk about the architectural form, so it has to, that architectural form has to become legible, or part of a system of legibility. So if we have new forms or emerging forms of urbanity, which are based on new systems of relations, other economic or cultural relations, that of course problematizes also the traditional bonds between territory and people, and therefore between the locale and what Rossi would call the collective memory. And of course also citizenship now is being constituted in a radically different way. So my question would be, how can the work of architecture in this context engage again with the city, whatever we mean by the city, and how the architectural project can address these new modes of production of the urban environment. And my first attempt to outline, not to give an answer, but to outline or to indicate a possible answer or another question, is that the question of type and typology cannot be posed only in formal or methodological terms, but also in relation to the production of disciplinary knowledge. And this I go back to the beginning and also to what Sam and Chris said at the very beginning about the production actually of a disciplinary knowledge, which can then define the general coordinates within which architectural works and urban strategies can be distinguished, yet that the limitations are being precisely negotiated. I mean, it's not that the architectural work becomes part of the urban, or the urban becomes the architectural work, but in one way they are still distinct, but they have to be precisely negotiated. And I think it's exactly there in this delineation of these negotiations, which for me the question then of the type and the typical becomes political. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Hard to follow on such amazing discussion already. And even though you think you're prepared, you never are. It's I've got to get this set up if I can. Okay. Sam and Chris, Helen, everyone, thank you very, very much for inviting me to be this op-ed opportunity. And Helen made me sound like a dreadful scoundrel that was going to chastise and all this, but really I'm a teddy bear, and I just want to hug them so much. for loving cities and actually for engendering yet again the discussion of cities, which is so, so important. And I'm sort of very worried about my time, so I'm going to try and be very quick. And I have far too many slides, but I hope you'll allow me to rip through them. And the part of the reason that Marina was sort of touching on this whole discussion of what is a city, and of course what is architecture and what is type and how do they relate. And when I wrote my piece, I was thinking, oh, you know, type's the easy way to make a city. You just repeat, 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 and no variation. That was the way you used to do it. And the sort of Stalinists and Rossi and people like this would do it that way, and the modernists, the big old bad modernists, would do it like that. And we live in a very different world with incredible patchiness in the world, where there's no one place that's the same as the other. And even in terms of climate change, which we think is a sort of standard kind of thing that's going to happen, the actual differentiation with places getting hotter and places getting colder is really very complicated. This is a Hansen map. He's the sort of pioneer of climate change studies, and he's very extreme. He says it's going to be 3 meters, 9 feet rise. You know, the US is saying 1 meter and preparing for that. But you can see that it's very different in different places. Some places are going to get very hot, some places are going to cool, flows are going to change in the environment. And this is going to impact cities in major, major ways. And it's going to impact the northwest metropolitan area, which is already, you know, underwater theoretically, even more. And when you look at the coast of China, they're saying, oh, we're going to copy the Dutch, but it's going to have to be a lot higher, you know. So China's on the edge. And so this is a very changing world, and it's a very dynamic, shifting place. And for me, not only type, but the idea of a transformative type with the heterotopia is a very important concept. So I sort of join with this team that Chris and Sam have put together, trying to face up to this challenge. And just looking back on the past, we always think of the modernists and Le Corbusier and so on, with Chandrigar and the sort of standardization and the type. But in fact, as the article about Brasilia shows, there's enormous variety within that morphology. But in fact, that's a minority sport, and the really major type was Levittown, 144,000 houses, gigantic acreage, and mass-produced housing, mass-produced cars, mass-produced energy, high energy consumption. The lucky winners have a TV, if you can see it, in the middle of their little house in a potato field, right? And this is the model that we never really talk about, but it is the megalopolis. And that was the American model, this was the kind of post-colonial model, and this was the Stalinist Nova Huta, the big new steel town, initially with the row house sort of apartment blocks, and then with the Khrushchev slab blocks, modernist blocks in the back. But while we think of these as being normative types, if you like, for the expansion of the city, in reality, in Latin America, all during the 70s and the 80s, and even now in the Philippines and across Indonesia and so on and so forth, you can find this self-built housing that actually the AA and Otto Königsberger, who was Nero's advisor, and then John Turner and the Tropical School and all this stuff were very, very influential with this, with Habitat in 1976, changing the orientation of the UN towards this self-built housing and the recognizing NGOs and bottom-up kind of structure of the city. This constitutes over 60% of major cities in Latin America. I'm not really good about the distribution in Asian cities, but the UN is expecting over a billion people by 2020 to be living in this kind of housing, self-built housing, which is not to be condemned as slums, as Mike Davis and people like that would do. And it's all part of this sort of megacity. This is a beautiful website by Janice Perlman, who was a PhD student in the 60s and 70s who studied the favelas when they were first coming out, gave up her professorship at Berkeley to found the Megacities Institute, a private institute, advising the UN, and it's tracking the growth of these megacities around the world. And initially, 8 million was a megacity, which would have been London or New York in 1945. And then she raised it to 12, and now it's 20, and now they're talking about megacity regions like the Pearl River Delta, 120 million. So how do you design for a city that's like that? It's amazing. And also, just as Marina was saying, the form of the city has changed. And it's absolutely staggering how much, and oh, I've done it myself. It's this wire, I know it. You can't breathe at the front here. It's a very sensitive, responsive environment. I promise not to do it again. Anyways, how do you design for a city which is changing its form so much? I want to have that. I'd like to have that other thing, because then I know what's coming up. I'm jet lagged, to put it mildly. So it helps to know what's coming. But anyway, so sorry, we were down here. And this is from my new book, Helen will like this, that I'm Urban Design Since 1945, A Global Perspective. And the UN focuses on the 8 or 10 megacities, which have 20 million or so. But that's only 8% of the cities, and that the rest of the 92% of the urban population in 2020 is expected to live in cities of between 1 to 2 to 3 million. And that's these other cities. So, and because they're smaller, there's a bigger chance that the NGOs and bottom-up kind of self-organization systems can have a chance to actually operate, and it'll be less of a top-down kind of World Bank situation. So I started to think about this new model of the city, and I'm guilty of my own simplification and type constructions, and this is just a very rapid flyby, but the old block used to be like in New York, I'm a real local now, 800 by 200. You get the sort of super block set up, and then you get these mega blocks, which like in Doxiadis' work, or Milton Keynes, or Chen Zhen, are like a kilometer square. But within them, they're very heterogeneous, and it's not, and so seeing dogma was very interesting, and that there is a lot of different elements within it. In this particular case, I'm looking at Bangkok with the Skyway, and then there'll be the big mega malls that were burnt in the political demonstrations, then a temple with the little lanes that were traditional housing around it, an agricultural area linked to the old canal, and then these newer soi or housing lanes. I'm not making this up. This is actually a piece of the new downtown of Bangkok, which has agriculture within the center of the city. Of course, it's all owned by the royal family. It's very complicated, but there's a reason why agriculture stayed there. And this is, you know, people call it the city, diffuse city that has agriculture built into it. And it used to be called the Desicota in the sociologists and anthropologists who studied this new form of the Asian city in the 1970s produced drawings like this. This is actually where Rem grew up, in Jakarta in Indonesia, the ex-Dutch colony, where agriculture and agricultural villages are part of the urban typology integrated into the system of the city. And it's also, if you start thinking about the way urban villages have survived, as even within London or you can go on and on, as a kind of weird survival piece, as a type within the city. It's kind of like part of our collective unconscious that's unrecognized. And how do you design for this kind of territory where fish farms and rice paddies are integrated into the center of the city? And this is Jakarta, but you can also find this in Tokyo, because the rice paddies are protected for national security reasons for food production. And if you go to Dharavi, the mega slum, according to Mike Davis, I'm sorry about my colors, they've gone all funny. It's probably this, no? But anyway, there's agriculture right by the railway station, and then there's fishing village, there's plastic recycling, this is the fish market, and then there's ceramics, and the whole thing is made up of a series of villages. This huge mega block has agriculture, it has also high-rise new modernist housing in it, and mat housing, and it's mainly a self-built system. And then, as I'm just sort of finishing up here, I'm looking at the ASRO, a group from the northwest, from Leuven, who do a lot of work for the UN. And why I'm looking at them is that their work, this is Vinh, which was a city bombed by the Americans in the war in Vietnam, but it has this incredible series of rice paddies and fish farms here. The French colonial beach situation, French always like to have a beach. And then the Vietnamese built a fort on the river here to protect themselves from the French, didn't work. And the old city was here. And then the Russians, after the Americans bombed it, they rebuilt it as this linear industrial city with the railway and the slab blocks, the sort of Khrushchev blocks coming in. And my friends at Leuven were asked to redesign this situation. And I was really interested how they did it. They brought back, this is the kind of landscape it is. It's really water, land, Russian mega blocks, slab blocks and highways, and then the beach. It's my kind of place, I think, actually, the beach anyway. Sorry. I guess I am a bubble person, I don't know. Maybe I'm being romantic, but the Asian city has a whole, this whole thing with the water rise and the desertification and the climate change, and Vietnam is rebuilding its cities up 2 meters in preparation for the change. And then they're also, and this ASRO group's been very important in working with the government in Hanoi to try and plan this, and now key members are moved to Beijing, so you know it's coming down the pike to try and replan the city, working with the water, and they talk about the sort of porosity of the city, how it works with water as part of the urban morphology. And then they produce this sort of floodable city. This is the old city core, which is over here, and it floods anyway. So they've made a floating market and new housing that's up on Pilotti, very modernist. And this is the big highway that comes through, and that's the old fort and fishing village. So this is like trying to work with what's there and blend the new morphologies and types in. But it's requiring kind of types beyond types. This was the whole message, that somehow we need to, and I feel very comfortable now having seen my other presenters and listened to them, that they're not rigid typologists. They are flexi types, which is what I like. And just to sort of finish up, I sort of pulling in, this is Chen Zhen, which was planned by the same people who made Milton Keynes, working with the Chinese planning authorities, just outside the border of Hong Kong, which is here. This is where all our Apples and iPods are made. And it grew from nothing to, they're predicting, 12, 14 million. It's going to be part of the 120 million megacity of the Pearl River Delta. And if you look at it, it's got a kind of civic center with a big axis through it, and then a hill with a statue of Deng on top. And then it's got this gigantic golf course. My students were very interested in that. But actually, the markings here are all the old agricultural villages from the collectivization done by Mao. And all of the people who live in there are now multimillionaires because they own the land around it, which has been developed for high-rise and factories. And they actually transformed their villages. This is from the new book, Analysis, the colors are all off. But basically, you have this formal unit of set up in the center, and then these are the high-rises, the golf course, and then the villages, which they're going to take out one by one with different strategies for each one. And this is what they actually look like. They were single-story shacks, and then they've become up to 12 stories with tiny lanes in between all the air conditioners and everything up in there. And this is where 60% of the workforce, the temporary floating workforce that came illegally to build the Apple computers and all the rest of it, this is where they live. And the towers, the official city, and here's the city hall with the central park, these things are right in the center. It's a little bit like Marylebone High Street in the middle of the grids of London, or Greenwich Village between the high rise of Midtown and downtown. And it's something we don't even think about in cities. My friends Urbanus, who, they're a Chinese group working in Chen Zhen, but now they've partnered with REM on the Shenzhen downtown remodeling. They had a beautiful scheme. They've had many beautiful schemes, but this was like questioning this whole village type and kind of making in skyhooks that go over the top out of Russian constructivism with public bathhouses and all the things that are missing, schools and other stuff that is missing from this setup. Only about 5 buildings being demolished for this sort of sky system to go across the top. And then vegetable gardens and green roof as well, and water collection and eco setup. And just to finish up, so this is a sectional solution to the type almost over the city. And then many of the projects that were in the actual AD issue that I admired very much, I think I'm critical of Rem with his patches because they tend to be monofunctional. We can talk about this. There's monofunctional types. This is Reiser and Utamoto, and it's big box retail and then a souk on the water and then housing slabs and mini towers and some office blocks and some sort of cultural thing in yellow at the bottom. And it's just like Marina was talking about, this new kind of logic. I don't know whether you can really see it on the slide, but this is why you have to buy the book to see it in detail or go to their website. But it's the logic of a recombinatory city that can work at multiple scales and transform type into new urban conditions. This is in a very extreme desert condition in Dubai, but and not lots of people are critical of Dubai, but this is a worthy experiment as far as I'm concerned. And if the people in Dubai paid for it, well, that all to the better. I mean, let's get it, let's investigate this. I don't think it's going to be built now, but the logic of this follows up on schemes they've done in outside of Seoul, and it involves the whole idea of the podium turning into a landscape and then unfolding in this case into the water, and so it's got multiple flow systems in it. And this is one's for Helen. Shameless self-promotion, as I'm always advised to do whenever I do a lecture. You have